The first thing she said was, it struck me, was that it takes 5 years approximately to move center of gravity.
Yeah.
And as therapists, we're not in a setting that's appropriate for doing that movement. And yet the world is in a place where it really needs that kind of movement. I'm curious of what different things we can do in our role as therapists to move that along.
Once you introduce a developmental component into an integral model, and again, it's only one of many components, but I think it's both the most useful and easily the most depressing component of the whole model. And just to give you a very simple reason, and I use several of these examples all the time because they still just floor me. If you look at spiral dynamics, Jane Lovinger also actually, her numbers agree fairly closely. Anything that we would call integral or centauric, really about 2% of the population is stably at those levels of development, and there are higher levels, of course. That's not big numbers. If you look at the general development is going, let's say, from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric, about 70% of the world's population is at ethnocentric or lower. Now that's just frightening. And I mean, we see it in this country. And again, it's not a judgment. Everybody starts at square one and goes through the developmental stages. So we have to have societies where people can always stop at whatever station they're going to stop at. We don't know why people transform. We have no bloody idea why that happens. So if somebody's going to stop at red, they're going to stop at red. And they're going to be blue, they're going to be blue, and so on. What we have to be careful about is to have governance structures that have laws that come at least from the world-centric or higher levels. And that's what we do in this country. So what the Constitution has is a series of orange laws. It says, you don't have to think this way. In the privacy of your own home, if you think Jesus is the sole Savior and that everybody's going to go to hell if you don't believe in Jesus, fine, think that in the privacy of your own home. But you're not allowed to go out on the public sphere and shoot somebody that disagrees with you. Now, unfortunately, they do that in Kansas if you're not watching. And so twice the last year, Kansas has outlawed the teaching of evolution. And the Supreme Court caught them, you know. The Supreme Court's over there like, Kansas, what was that? You know, it's like, what was that behind your back? Well, it's the Bible and another few. If we had one person, one vote democracy in this country, the South would reinstitute segregation in some areas. Kansas would outlaw the teaching of evolution. Wyoming would make homophobia allowable. Again, it sounds harsh, but I'm really trying to be descriptive. People are allowed to be at those levels, but they're not allowed to be in charge of governance. So the developmental model puts a staggering curb on what we can do realistically in the world, when 70% of the world's population is at some of these levels of development. So I know when I started, I mean, I'm a classic boomer. Most of the fallacies that I've written about because I did them, and that's how I figured them out. Slowly, but and I only have probably 10, 15 more fallacies that I haven't figured out that I'm operating on. So I'm making progress, because I've spotted 3 of them. And part of it, we had the Aquarian conspiracy. We had the greening of America. All we had to do was learn a new paradigm. And everybody was going from beige to turquoise. Just like that. You just read one book, 8 Stages of Transformation on a weekend. It's just not, right now, if you use the 5-year rule, that's 40 years of transformation. And we sort of thought we were just going to descend on the world because we had a holographic paradigm, whatever the hell that meant. So once you introduce this actual model, it severely curbs a certain kind of, it's hard to get, where's that joy that we want arising is one of the things we want to say. So that's just a real politic we have to keep in mind about doing that. But there are good news items tucked into that. And one is that it's almost always been the case in various epochs in world history where societies recognize the best and the brightest. And this sort of everybody is the same egalitarian thing, nobody really believes that. If I'm going to have brain surgery, I don't want my neighbor doing it. I know this brain surgeon that's much better at it. And so the same kind of thing happens whether it's looking towards shamans or priests or people of wisdom, men and women of wisdom. And part of what we want from the healing professions and from people that are engaged in psychotherapy and people that are engaged in integral psychology is to become part of a wisdom culture that can give advice on how people transform and what it means. And even understanding where people are in a developmental spectrum can help people in positions of power, and there are people in positions of power, make wiser decisions. But what hasn't happened is psychology hasn't been able to establish itself as a dependable source of information about this because it's been so fragmented and so splintered and so on. And you have 12 schools of psychology, roughly, and none of them agree with each other. So why on earth should any leader look to psychology to tell them anything? The only hope for the field as a whole is that by becoming integral, we can say, look, all 12 of those schools have something important to say. And if we put those all together, we can start to make recommendations to policymakers about how to deal with some of these things. And I would have thought even that was far-fetched, except, and this is sort of, blowing my own horn a little bit, but some of you know that, both Bill Clinton and Al Gore, Jeb Bush and Karl Rove have all read my books, and Bill Clinton in particular knows them, and he actually is quoting from them. And we're going to get together and he's going to do an integral naked dialogue and stuff like that. So even in I think about a 5-year period, there are world leaders, Tony Blair is another one, that are actually looking at this very seriously. And Clinton actually recently gave a speech where he said one of the reasons there was so much trouble in the Middle East is that only 2% of the population had an integral awareness. So. That's a little glimmer of hope in how to move this forward. But what we have to be able to do is really pioneer ways where, first of all, you can do it with one other human being. And then we can start working that. This is how that works, and this is how we can work with families, and this is how you can start to work with communities, and this is how you can start to be in an advisory capacity, both to help spot where people are and then help transform them where we can. But it's just as important to have an accurate map of where people are as it is to be able to change them. Because again, that change process is very, very hard. But if you go in and assume, like just a couple of very quick examples. We think that we can simply go in with a human rights green meme initiative right in the middle of China, good old red to blue China, and they're going to just suck up our human rights, love it, and change overnight. Now, if you have a developmental scale, you're much more realistic about what you can do under these circumstances. If you're working in Iraq and Iran, where there are red meme, basically tribal warfare, and the highest you can get is a blue Islamic structure, at least you know that. And you can start working. You become much more realistic about how you can deploy your resources. What none of the world's leaders have is a group of mental health professionals that are integral. So that's the best thing that can happen, is that a learning community like this can start to generate that kind of information based on research, pulling together knowledge from these different disciplines and making a coherent whole out of it. That's a little bit better than not being able to do anything at all.